John. Very pleased to welcome Johanna Gill as our second speaker. Johanna is President of the Society of Chartered Surveyors Ireland, and she's also a registered valuer and Director in the Valuation Advisory Department in Cushman and Wakefield, where she heads up the fund valuation team, working for clients such as Irish Life Investment Managers, Hibernian REIT and Hammerson. SCSI Western Branch came on board as our sponsors for our second conference in 2012 and have been great supporters of the conference ever since. So I'd just like to thank Johanna for travelling up from Dublin to be with us today, and also to the members, local SCSI members have supported us so well over the years. Today Johanna is going to take a kind of a holistic view on how we might produce better buildings.
Thanks, Martin. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to apologise in advance if I start coughing. I unfortunately haven't been skiing in northern Italy, nor have I been in China, but I have a cough that I haven't managed to shift since January, and it's really annoying at this stage. So if I do start coughing, just talk amongst yourselves for a while. I'll be fine. So, what is building better buildings? You can probably tell from the slides, there's an element of sustainability in here. But for me, it's not just about the environment and sustainability. It also touches on the wellness piece, and I'm really interested to see what Jane is going to be saying later in terms of the specifics of how that impacts on the construction sector. But it is clear, and John touched on it earlier, we are at a bit of a turning point, and every single one of us in this room is going to be affected. We need to reimagine and re-examine how we deal with residential buildings, commercial buildings, civic spaces, how we deal with buildings, streets, public areas. And certainly the pace of change is faster. It is a bit daunting, but it's also very exciting, and it certainly offers lots of opportunities for people who want to stand up and be counted and actually make a difference and do something different. It is incumbent on us all to think about what it means personally and professionally, and to try and come up with those solutions. And I'll admit that today I'm probably going to be asking more questions than I am providing answers, but I would encourage you to try and take a step up to the higher level sort of strategy view. A lot of us get very bedded down in the weeds in our day-to-day, and this is a really good opportunity for you to think about what it means for you and how you can actually make a difference. So very briefly about me, yes, I am the President of the Society of Chartered Surveyors, and my day job, I work in the valuation team in Cushman and Wakefield. And I suppose that's where my interest in better buildings has really been sparked. But what grew it was, when I took on the presidency in SCSI, one of the things I wanted to do was to meet different professional groups. So I've been working in property for nearly 25 years now, started very young. So I know quite a lot about property, but actually I know very little about construction. And I've learned so much over the last 6 months in terms of talking to building surveyors, quantity surveyors, mineral surveyors, geomatic surveyors. And it's amazing, having attended various meetings, how many common themes there are. We all think we're in our little silos and our little different groups, and it's amazing how many common themes there are. And also what's been amazing and really interesting for me is how passionate surveyors and people working in property and construction are about their jobs. I suspect if you talk to a group of accountants or lawyers, they wouldn't quite be as excited as we are about our jobs, and that's something we should be very proud of, and we need to be leaning on that and getting the most out of it. So I would challenge you, as I say today, to try and think bigger picture, think about what you can do better. So what does better mean? So better for me means better for everybody, basically. So I've broken it down to a few different sectors to try and cover the kind of details. Now, first piece is better for occupiers. Now, obviously, these examples are all pretty extreme. Yes, a good few of them are from Google. I'm not sure if you can really see, but this top slide here, top left, has a slide coming down. I don't know how any of us would really feel about having a slide in our office, but, you know, that's fine. But it's not just about the extreme slides and crazy golf, which, you know, most of us probably won't have in our offices. But it is about your actual environment, how you feel where you work. I appreciate some of you here are students, so you haven't necessarily been in a work environment, but for many people, GMIT is a work environment, so we need to think about that as well. So it's about having a slightly nicer environment that you feel glad to be coming to work in every day. That might be more breakout areas, standing up desks, sitting down desks, there's all sorts of options. It comes down to things like bike facilities, shower facilities. Again, John touched on, the modes of transport. There will be more people walking, cycling, scootering to work. So we need to think about how we can make those places better for the occupiers. Some of it is about fit out, some of it is about how it makes people feel. So people feel better in a nicer environment, people feel better in a building that is greener. People do actually care about the environment now. Not that we didn't care in the past, but we're just caring a little bit more now. And the increased awareness of the wellness piece is really important. All these pictures are from commercial buildings. It's not just commercial, it's obviously residential as well. So again, it's about being in a nicer environment in your home, whether you're renting or whether you're an owner-occupier. It's about the difference that makes to your bills in terms of the differences in terms of running costs from, say, a D-rated house to an A-rated house, etc. So better for occupiers very quickly leads on to better for business. And one of the things I would say is we start talking about sustainability and people go, oh yeah, grand, whatever, And a lot of that is because people think you have to be a tree hugger to, want to be into sustainability. But actually it's not, and I don't really care what motivates you, to be honest with you. If it's money, that's fine. We're all going to end up in a better situation if we all move towards this better buildings piece. So from a business perspective, which can be challenging because there are normally extra costs involved, one of the things we should be thinking about as employers is salaries and benefits typically account for around 90% of an organisation's operating costs. And so the productivity of our staff is really important. And retaining staff is really important. Attracting the best staff is really important. And that is becoming more of a thing now in terms of staff choosing which companies to work in, which buildings to work in, where are they located. It's becoming more of an issue. And if you think, any of you who are employers here, who've had to deal with retention and replacement and the cost and effort that goes into replacing staff, it would be much better to keep them in an environment that they like. There is some research. Now, I'm not an academic, and I know there's probably a lot of judgment put around research, and certainly we're a bit light on research at the moment in this area. But there is some research that suggests, it's undertaken by a firm called Stoke, who are a US real estate firm, and they have assessed that businesses who occupy a high-performance building can see an increase in profitability of $4,000 per annum per employee. They've also managed to equate that to a per square foot amount of $18.56 per square foot per annum. Now, you can pick holes in all sorts of research, and I'm sure there's research that will probably contradict that, but it is an interesting one, and I think it should make us think about the impact that the environment can have on our employees. Reduced OPEX obviously is another important piece from a business perspective. The same study have come up with figures that you can save between 20 to 30% on your, in a certified building in terms of cost saving for energy and water. And that sounds like quite a lot, but actually they're only relatively small amounts. Go back to the 90% is based around salaries. So in reality, you're talking about fairly small amounts, but still worth thinking about. So, better for the environment. So here we are finally. So as John said, we do have pretty strong targets. We've pretty much failed to meet our 2020 ones, and I suspect 2030 could be a challenge because we're now starting from a worse place. As a country, we are paying fines for having not met our targets. And buildings account for 40% of EU energy consumption. So we really need to start doing something pretty quickly about it. We have, the greener building piece makes sense to everybody if you think about it. But often we don't do what makes sense, like going to the dentist, often you don't do it until you really have to. So the government are forcing us in ways, so we have the NZEB requirement now in. They're likely to go further. We were talking to our sustainability guy in Cushman's, and in the UK, the government have already introduced a change in the EPC, BER cert level. So if you're putting a property on the market, it has to be at a certain EPC level, which is the equivalent of our BER. So you can't let it otherwise. So landlords are having to now spend the money on refurbishing, recommissioning, redoing facades, replacing windows, that kind of thing. So that is likely to come down the tracks sooner rather than later, and we need to start thinking about how we're going to deal with that. Better for landlords and owners. Now, this one is probably harder to quantify. Most people you would talk to would say, yes, well, a green building or a high-performance building should be worth more, but it's very difficult to try and actually quantify it, and as a valuer, I'm always looking for the evidence to prove it. Is there less letting risk? Well, there probably is. It would seem that certainly the bigger occupiers want better buildings, and therefore one would expect that you would have a lower void period. Green Street Advisors, who are a UK-based firm, have also done some research, caveated small sample, etc., etc. But their stats show that there is an indication of higher occupancy for certified buildings. So that is a motivating factor for landlords. You potentially are attracting better tenant covenants and possibly have improved rental values. Again, we can't really prove that yet. I'd love somebody to do some research on that because we need a little bit of evidence behind us to really give us a push on this market. The two pictures here on the right, if you can see them, are the Salesforce building in Dublin, and the one on the left is One Women Lane, which is a development by Hibernia. Now, I have been involved in valuing both of them, so full disclosure on that. But Salesforce, on the one on the right, they are actually paying, they were in negotiations, they agreed to pay rent on this new building, and then they actually said to the landlord, right, we want you to upgrade it to the latest LEED V4 and we will pay a higher rent per square foot. So they are actually proving that tenants will pay a higher rent per square foot. I was at an event recently where one of the head guys from LinkedIn also said LinkedIn will pay a higher rent per square foot. But again, it's only anecdotal, people chatting, it doesn't really help us to prove it. So the question of, do you have improved yields and investment values? Again, your instinct would say yes, you do, but it's very hard to prove it. Going back to Green Street, they do have findings of single-digit percentage sales premiums for green buildings. But again, it's a very small sample and very hard to prove. And I suppose if you talk to investors, and we would liaise quite a lot with people who are actually out in the market, they are definitely looking at this in a little bit more detail now. They are looking at the differences between, different levels of LEED and BER ratings. My sense is, to be honest with you, that it's probably leading to more of a brown discount rather than a green premium. So the green stuff tends to be at the higher end of the market, which is very tight anyway. The brown premium, we are looking at circumstances where you've got older buildings, and I decided not to put up a picture of an older building in case I might offend somebody, particularly my clients don't like to do that. But the issue is that people are looking, we've had situations where we've been valuing buildings where investors are looking to buy them, and they're older buildings, they have lower BERs, and they are specifically factoring in costs to refurbish and upgrade, and that can be facade works, window works, obviously work to the M&E, other internal works. It's not an insignificant amount of money, and lots of the European German funds particularly, they will have remits now. Their remits on investment are getting quite tight, and they have, a lot of them now are just not allowed to buy a building that is below a certain level in terms of BER. So my sense is, I say the top end of the market is quite tight anyway, so my sense is that currently, and in the sort of short to medium term, we are more looking at a kind of a brown discount. I mean, it's clear the dial is only going one way in this environmental piece, and so we all need to be kind of on the bus, if you like. Now, what's motivating landlords and owners? Probably is profit, to be honest with you. They'll play lip service, perhaps, and perhaps I'm being a little bit unfair there, so apologies to anyone in the room who's offended by that comment. But there are elements of, corporate social responsibility, the ESG piece, but ultimately, most people are in business to make money. And as I said earlier, I don't really care what their motivation is, so long as they're delivering better buildings for everybody, for the environment, for everybody, that's fine. So I'm going to touch a little bit on the what, where, and how. So this is where the real practical challenges come in. The stuff I've been talking about up to now is, ideas and mindsets and, different approaches. This kind of stuff is the real nuts and bolts that we need to get into. So we are all familiar with the reduce, reuse, recycle mantra, and we all have probably gotten a little bit hung up on the last piece of it. But we certainly need to look at the first two parts, particularly when we're talking about buildings. So, can we reduce the number of buildings we have? Probably not really. Can we reduce the number of new buildings we have? Yes, we probably can, but we still are always going to need new buildings. So the key is that we make sure the new buildings are better. According to the World Green Building Council, 11% of global emissions are from the upfront emissions associated with the initial constructions. It's basically embodied carbon. John touched on it a little bit earlier as well. So this graph in the centre, which, sorry, it's a bit blurry, I did rob it from a PDF, don't tell anybody, but so this graph starts with what the various different stages are of when you can impact on embodied carbon. So the embodied carbon piece is to do with, and again, sorry, probably a lot of you in the audience already know this. I'm very conscious I'm not on the construction side, but it's about what it takes to make the concrete and bring the materials to the site. It's all that kind of stuff. It's about actually physically putting the building together. So this shows you, on the left-hand start, you start at the planning stage, and that's where you can have most impact on embodied carbon. And the first decision is don't build. So that's kind of fine, but not really what we're all about. The next option is build less. Again, that's not going to help us in terms of trying to progress in terms of commercial and residential development from an Irish perspective. We need to be building more. So we move on to the build clever and build efficiently. Now the impact starts to reduce, but it's still fairly reasonable at the build clever stage. And the build clever and build efficiently is about the construction materials we're using, the design we're putting into the building, the orientation of the building. Things like rainwater harvesting obviously doesn't impact on the embodied carbon, but it impacts on the life cycle of the emissions. Can we refurbish instead of building new? We need to look at densities. Density in appropriate places where we have good public transport links is really crucial, and we certainly need to be challenging the planning on that. And we do need to look more about mixes of uses, etc. So the next piece is the how. This is where I get really out of my depth in this audience. So I'm not going to dwell on this. I'm just going to touch on a few things. Again, what I'm trying to do here is challenge you to think strategically, think higher level, think what you can actually do. So options we need to look at in terms of construction going forward: modular construction or other modern methods of construction, 3D printing. I mean, to be honest, the whole 3D printing thing just completely blows my mind. I can't quite get my head around it at all. But is there, more standardization we can do, better efficiency at the construction stage? What are we doing with demolition waste? Where does it go? What do we use it for? How far away are we taking it? How far away are we drawing on materials for building, etc.? The other thing that we do need to think about here, and it's certainly related to the construction and availability, is the finance piece. How do we look at structuring finance? There are green loans coming through, but we need to look at the piece around the differences between finance and availability finance for development projects, and how we can look at the life cycle costing tied in with finance. It's not just all about the upfront cost on day one, because it does cost more to build green, and you'll have heard the studies on how much more it costs to build green. So we need to think about what the long-term life cycle cost of the building is, what the operational costs of the building are, and how that feeds into the value, and therefore how the finance companies can get comfortable with it. We also need to look at smart buildings. I'm going to touch on an example now in a moment on a smart building, but we are the age of data. There is so much data out there. We just need to figure out what to do with it and how we harness it and how we best use it to look at more automation and control, etc., etc. So I'm going to touch on, just briefly, 2 case studies. First one is a residential one, and this is not a recent development. It was built in 2000. This was the UK's first large-scale eco-village, designed to be carbon neutral, as I say, back in the early 2000s. And it was the first construction project where a local authority sold land at below market value to facilitate a sustainable development. and to make it economically viable. So it was a bit of a sort of a JV between the council. So 100 homes, some offices, some college facilities, lots of green technologies proved to be quite challenging to adopt. For example, they were looking at, so they do rainwater collection where they harvest the rain from the roofs and they use it to flush the toilets, etc. But they were looking at what they had called a living machine system of recycling wastewater to use. Now, it was installed, but it didn't meet the appropriate standards when they actually started trying to run it. So that didn't quite work. But other things, there's a less reliance on cars, but you can see some of the stats there. So their mains water consumption was reduced by 50%, and their electricity costs, which isn't there, but I think it was around 25% in an average UK house. And what was actually really interesting, I actually visited this with my brother. I was living in London at the time, and he came to visit me. He was studying architecture, and he's going to make the world better, you know. Bless him. Anyway, we went down to look at this, and they had like a kind of show house that you could look at. And one of the things that I found really interesting is the electricity meter, which in most of our houses is hidden up somewhere really high, you can't see it, whatever, or it's outside. The electricity meter in these houses is in either the hall or the kitchen, and it's behind a glass pane. So you can actually see the thing spinning around and how much it makes a difference when you turn on the kettle or you turn off a light. And a simple thing like that in terms of making occupiers actually see what electricity they're using has an impact on them turning off lights, etc. So it really is quite inspirational. And again, as a valuer, what's really interesting for me is, because this is a slightly older project, we have good stats, but basically since it was constructed, the statistics are that the average sales prices in this scheme are between 5 and 10% above similar properties in the vicinity because of their green credentials. So that is certainly worth thinking about. The next example I'm going to give you is from the Netherlands, from Amsterdam. It's a commercial building. And this is really also, it's about sustainability and smart buildings. So this was built specifically for Deloitte, who are consolidating a number of employees, 40,000 square metres. It got outstanding BREEAM rating. So this is things like, again, those of you who are familiar with BREEAM and LEED will understand, but it's things about, the building is orientated based on the sun's path. They've got PV panels on the roof and the south facade. They've got smart lighting, which obviously comes on when you walk into a room. But beyond that, they have in every second light fitting, they have a sensor. They have 30,000 sensors in the building, taking data in on things like temperature, humidity, etc., and they automatically adjust on that basis. But it also takes into account things like occupier use. So it's able to, and they use this in their property management system, so it's able to identify if a particular building has been used that day or that week. And if it hasn't, then they go, well, it doesn't need to be cleaned. So they are improving efficiencies across the board in that building. They use rainwater harvesting, etc., etc. So it's just one example. And again, this is not that recent. It's a good few years now. But it's just one example of what can be done. There are examples in Ireland, but I decided to, again, not get particularly close to any particular group or client or company. But there are examples in Ireland of really good situations where we are developing this kind of construction and technology, and I would really encourage you to think about it. So, what's next? So, shamelessly, yes, I am here to try and get people to volunteer to become more involved in SCSI, but I think what we need people to be thinking outside the box. We need people to be coming up with ideas. So I would like you, after this, to talk to each other, share ideas, spark ideas, see what things you might have already been thinking about something and you could take it forward, or supporting somebody else who has an idea in terms of taking it forward. And certainly SCSI offers the opportunity to do that in a safe environment, in a supportive environment, breaking down some of the commercial advantages or disadvantages that may exist. And we need to be looking at how across different sectors and professional groups we can work together. And we need to look at how SCSI can work with other bodies, whether it's CIF or CIOB, because we're all trying to achieve the same thing, and together we can achieve more. So I would encourage you to Not just leave here and think, well, that was kind of remotely interesting chat. Actually think about what you can do about it and try and take action. So I will leave that thought with you. Thank you very much.